On a November afternoon in 1889, an emperor was asked to leave his own country. Emperor Pedro II, the last ruler of the Empire of Brazil, received the news with quiet resignation. His reign of nearly 5 decades ended not with a battle, but with a whisper. This moment poses a grand historical puzzle. How did a European prince build a stable, lasting empire in South America, a continent that otherwise shattered into republics? And what were the hidden scandals and unresolved mysteries that led to its startlingly peaceful downfall? By the end of this story, you will understand the complete saga of this forgotten empire, from its dramatic birth to its enigmatic collapse. We will explore the secret alliances that forged it, the internal contradictions that sustained it, and the quiet betrayal that dissolved it overnight. What does the fate of an empire tell us about the fragile nature of power itself? The empire's story begins not in a palace throne room, but on the muddy banks of a river. The date was September 7, 1822. Prince Pedro, the impatient son of the Portuguese king, was traveling near the Ipiranga stream when messengers from his father's court finally caught up to him. They carried letters demanding his immediate return to Lisbon, where he would be reduced to a mere prince again, and Brazil returned to colonial status. What happened next is the founding legend of a nation, yet its truth is shrouded in deliberate mystery. According to the famous painting and the official story, Pedro drew his sword, raised it high, and shouted, "Independence or death." The cry of Ipiranga was a spontaneous, heroic outburst of a man choosing his people over his crown. But history rarely operates on pure emotion. Was this a genuine moment of patriotic fury, or was it a brilliantly staged piece of political theater? The evidence suggests a calculated performance. Pedro was not alone. By his side was his powerful lover, Domitila de Castro, a woman of fierce ambition who openly despised the Portuguese court and its demands. Many historians believe she and a circle of Brazilian advisors had been pushing Pedro toward this break for months, crafting the very narrative of liberation. The messenger's arrival provided the perfect dramatic catalyst. The shout by the river was likely the planned signal, the public kickoff for a separation that had already been decided in private. This was a breathtaking gamble. Declaring independence from a European empire was an act of rebellion, and Pedro had no guaranteed army to back him. Portugal could, in theory, crush this uprising. Yet they did not. Here lies another layer of the mystery. Why did the Portuguese crown, which had fought to reclaim other colonies, offer such feeble resistance? The answer whispers from across the Atlantic. The hidden architect of Brazil's smooth independence was the British Empire. Britain, the dominant naval power, had a voracious appetite for Brazilian cotton, sugar, and soon coffee. A stable, independent Brazil under a friendly monarch was far better for business than a turbulent colony or a fragmenting republic. British diplomats quietly ensured Portugal stood down, their support the unspoken guarantee that turned Pedro's cry into a viable revolution. So, the Empire of Brazil was born from a paradox. It was a revolution led by a European prince, a separation negotiated with backroom deals, and a new nation whose sovereignty was midwifed by a foreign power. This contradictory beginning, a seemingly spontaneous cry underpinned by cold calculation, set the pattern for everything that would follow. The empire emerged not through a clean, ideological break, but as a pragmatic solution to a very messy problem. And that solution created a nation utterly unique in the Americas, a continental anomaly whose survival now depended on the man who had, for a moment by a river, chosen to become an emperor. Pedro I was a man who seemed to contain two opposing souls within one body. He was a liberal revolutionary who personally granted Brazil a constitution, yet he dissolved its first parliament and ruled by decree. He was celebrated as a war hero for defending Brazil's claims in the south, yet that very conflict ended with the loss of the territory that would become Uruguay. To the Brazilian people, he was their liberator emperor, a towering figure of independence, but in his heart and his habits he remained unmistakably, stubbornly Portuguese. This deep contradiction became the central tension of his reign. He surrounded himself with Portuguese advisors, spoke Portuguese with a thick accent that grated on Brazilian ears, and his personal life became a public spectacle of scandal. His very public affair with Domitila de Castro, whom he made a marchioness, alienated the court and the growing urban elite who expected royal decorum. Then a profound personal tragedy struck. His wife, Empress Leopoldina, died in 1826 under circumstances that fueled whispers of neglect and mistreatment, a dark cloud of scandal that never fully lifted. The empire's finances were in disarray, the political elite was turning against him, and grief seemed to weigh him down, yet none of this fully explains what happened next. In April 1831, after less than a decade on the throne, Pedro I simply stepped down. He abdicated in favor of his 5-year-old son. Pedro II boarded a ship and sailed back to Portugal. It was a shockingly quiet exit for such a volcanic personality. Why? The surface reasons were clear enough: political isolation, financial trouble, and a wearying barrage of protests. But historians puzzle over a more intriguing possibility. Was his abdication not a retreat but a strategic redeployment? His brother had died in Portugal, leaving the Portuguese throne contested. By returning to Europe, Pedro could fight to reclaim that crown not for himself, but for his young daughter, Maria da Gloria. In this light, his departure looks less like a defeat and more like a dynastic gambit, prioritizing the House of Braganza's European future over its American experiment. His true loyalty, it seems, was always to his bloodline first and to Brazil second. This abrupt departure left behind a nation that was barely a decade old, now in the hands of a child. The empire's foundation, built on a prince's calculated shout and a foreign power's quiet support, was exposed as terrifyingly fragile. The question hanging in the air was no longer about the emperor's contradictions, but about survival itself. Could a nation of such vast size and complexity, now led by a boy king, possibly hold itself together? The child emperor was now a political abstraction, a name on a document too young to hold a pen. For 9 turbulent years, from 1831 to 1840, Brazil was not ruled by a monarch but by a committee. This was the Regency, a desperate experiment in republican-style governance by a council of regents, and it brought the empire to the very edge of disintegration. The central mystery of this period is not why there were rebellions, but how the country survived them at all. Without the unifying symbol of a crowned head, the vast provinces, connected by little more than dirt tracks and sailing ships, began to pull violently apart. In the steaming Amazon rainforest, the Cabanejum revolt erupted. This was not a simple political protest, but a class and race war of staggering ferocity. Indigenous people, mixed-race caboclos, and freed slaves rose up against the white merchant elite of Pará, seizing the provincial capital for months. The message was clear: the distant central government in Rio de Janeiro meant nothing here. Simultaneously, in the far south, the Ragamuffin War began. Wealthy cattle ranchers and gauchos in Rio Grande do Sul, angered by high taxes on their prized jerked beef, declared their own independent republic. They were led by cunning military commanders and possessed a fierce cavalry that seemed invincible on the open plains. To the north and the south, Brazil was literally breaking into pieces, each revolt with its own flag, its own government, and its own vision of a future without the empire. The regents in Rio were shadowy, rotating figures, often more concerned with parliamentary squabbles than the fires raging on the frontiers. They slashed the national army to prevent a military coup, which left them relying on unreliable regional militias and private armies to put down the revolts. It was a recipe for warlordism, for the very fragmentation everyone feared. Yet, amid the chaos, a quiet and powerful consensus began to form among the landowning, political, and commercial elites in the capital. The experiment was failing. The Regency's weak, decentralized rule was an invitation to endless civil war. They saw a stark choice. Either Brazil would shatter into a dozen squabbling republics, vulnerable to foreign powers and economic ruin, or it must rediscover a central, unifying authority. Their gaze turned, almost reluctantly, to the palace. There, a bookish, shy boy was being given the most intense education imaginable, trained in languages, sciences, and statecraft by the best tutors. The elites realized their salvation lay in the very institution they had weakened. The monarchy was not the problem, it was the only possible solution. The mystique of the crown, the symbolic power of a single person above factional politics, was the only glue strong enough to hold the nation together. So, in a move of profound political irony, the same class that had chafed under Pedro I now orchestrated a constitutional coup of sorts. They declared the 14-year-old Pedro II of age in 1840, years earlier than legally required. It was not a celebration of his maturity, but a desperate gamble for national survival. They were not handing power to a teenager, they were resurrecting the crown itself as a living, breathing firewall against chaos. The boy walking onto the stage was their last, best hope to solve the mystery of a nation that refused to die. The palace presented the boy emperor to the nation as a divine savior, but the reality was a carefully managed political operation. On that July day in 1841, the coronation of Pedro II was a spectacle of overwhelming grandeur, designed to erase the memory of a decade of Regency chaos. The 15-year-old, draped in a mantle of green velvet and wearing a crown so heavy it required practice to balance, was paraded through Rio de Janeiro. The streets were strewn with flowers, cannons fired salutes, and the church bells rang incessantly. It was a powerful piece of political theater, a visual argument for stability. The message was unambiguous. The fractured nation now had a single, sacred focal point once more. Yet behind the pomp, a small circle of powerful landowners, politicians, and courtiers, the true kingmakers, breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had not chosen a warrior or a politician, they had installed a symbol. They believed this quiet, studious boy would be a malleable figurehead, a living seal of approval for their own governance. To prepare him for this role, they had subjected him to a brutal, lonely education. From dawn until late at night, his tutors drilled him in law, theology, mathematics, and half a dozen languages. His playmates were books, his recreation was the study of astronomy or botany. He was raised in near isolation from other children, forged into a repository of knowledge but starved of ordinary human connection. This created the central psychological mystery of Pedro II. The system produced a monarch of immense intellect and personal integrity, a man who would correspond with scientists like Louis Pasteur and Alexander Graham Bell, who would fund observatories and literary academies. Yet it also created a ruler profoundly uncomfortable with the messy, emotional business of politics and personal intrigue. He saw the court's flattery as hollow and its squabbles as petty distractions from the progress of civilization. This disconnect between the man and his office would become the empire's greatest strength and ultimately its fatal weakness. For decades, his aloof, incorruptible personality would provide the perfect neutral arbiter in a turbulent political system, a king above faction. But it also meant he would never truly understand the beating heart of his own country, or the new forces of republicanism and social change that were slowly gathering strength in the coffee plantations and city streets. The boy who became an emperor to save an empire was, in the end, a puzzle he himself could never solve. The empire's newfound stability rested on a single, intoxicating bean. Coffee transformed Brazil from a fragile collection of provinces into a global economic powerhouse, and the story of this transformation is a tale of soil, sweat, and a profound national contradiction. In the fertile red earth of the Paraíba Valley, just inland from Rio de Janeiro, a new aristocracy was born. These were the coffee barons, men who amassed fortunes so vast they built palaces in the hills, modeled on European estates, and lived with an opulence that rivaled the emperor's own court. Their wealth financed railroads, modernized ports, and filled the empire's treasury with export taxes. This river of coffee money provided the financial glue that held the nation together, funding the army that finally crushed the Southern Ragamuffin revolt and bankrolling the imperial government's operations. On the surface, it was a perfect engine of prosperity, making Brazil the undisputed coffee king of the world. But this economic miracle contained a dark and terrible secret, one that the elegant drawing rooms of Rio chose to ignore. The entire system was built on the backs of enslaved people. Here lies the central, agonizing paradox of the Empire of Brazil. It presented itself to the world as a civilized, constitutional monarchy, a beacon of progress in the tropics. Pedro II himself was a man of science and letters, deeply embarrassed by the institution of slavery, which he called a national cancer. Yet the economic lifeblood of his empire, the very source of its political stability, required the continual importation and brutal exploitation of human beings. By the 1850s, while nations across the Americas were abolishing the practice, Brazil was desperately trafficking more and more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, defying British naval patrols in a shameful clandestine trade. The coffee plantations were machines of grueling labor. From before dawn until after dusk, enslaved men, women, and children were driven through a relentless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and processing. The wealth that built mansions and railroads was extracted through a system of calculated cruelty. This created an impossible tension. Internationally, Brazil became a pariah, pressured relentlessly by the British Empire, which used diplomacy and naval power to force an end to the slave trade. Domestically, a small but growing abolitionist movement began to voice a moral critique that slowly seeped into urban consciousness. But the coffee barons, the most powerful political class in the nation, were utterly dependent on the system. They dominated parliament, and their answer to every problem was more land, more coffee, and more enslaved labor. The empire was thus trapped in a dilemma of its own making. Its modern identity was at war with its archaic economic foundation. Every bag of coffee sold in New York or London carried with it the invisible weight of this contradiction. The prosperity that ensured stability also guaranteed a coming storm. The emperor could see the moral abyss, but the economic and political cost of crossing it seemed unimaginably high. This ticking time bomb, buried in the rich soil of the coffee plantations, would eventually force a crisis that neither the thoughtful emperor nor his powerful barons could peacefully resolve. The empire's moral contradiction was about to meet its brutal test on a distant battlefield. In 1864, a conflict ignited in the heart of South America that would dwarf all others, a war so catastrophic it would reshape the continent and set a hidden timer on the Brazilian monarchy itself. This was the War of the Triple Alliance, a grinding, 5-year nightmare against Paraguay, a small but fiercely militarized nation led by the fanatical Marshal Francisco Solano Lopez. On the surface, the cause was a tangled web of regional power struggles and a Paraguayan invasion of Brazil's southern province. But the deeper mystery lies not in how the war started, but in what its staggering consequences revealed about the empire's hidden fractures. Brazil, allied with Argentina and Uruguay, expected a swift victory. Instead, they marched into a meat grinder. The Paraguayan forces, though outnumbered, fought with a desperate, suicidal tenacity, leveraging the treacherous terrain of swamps and jungles. Brazilian soldiers, many of them conscripts from the poorest parts of the country, died not just from bullets but from cholera, starvation, and exhaustion in their thousands. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. Brazil suffered an estimated 50,000 dead, with total casualties across all nations reaching into the hundreds of thousands, a demographic catastrophe for the region. This river of blood, spilled for a victory that seemed to offer little to the average Brazilian, began to turn public sentiment. Fathers and mothers in the countryside started to ask a dangerous question. What was their son dying for in a faraway swamp, if not to protect the vast estates of the coffee barons? The financial cost was equally devastating. The empire emptied its treasury, taking on massive debts from British banks to fund the war machine, mortgages on the nation's future that would strangle economic development for a generation. Yet within this tragedy, a profound irony took root. Desperate for manpower, the Brazilian government made a fateful promise. Any enslaved person who volunteered to fight would be granted their freedom. Thousands did, forming all-black battalions that fought with legendary bravery. These soldiers returned home as free men, heroes in uniform, living proof that black Brazilians were citizens, not property. Their very existence became a powerful, unanswerable argument for abolition, accelerating a debate the plantation owners had hoped to stifle forever. Most critically, the war created a new and powerful political force, a professional, battle-hardened military. The army officers who had witnessed the empire's logistical failures and staggering bureaucracy firsthand returned home feeling deeply disrespected. They believed their sacrifices were overlooked by a civilian government and a parliament they saw as corrupt and self-interested. The emperor, for all his personal respect for the military, failed to truly integrate this proud, discontented institution into the political fold. He saw them as a tool of the state, not a partner in governance. So, in a cruel historical twist, the empire's greatest military triumph planted the very seeds of its downfall. It left the nation bankrupt, the populace disillusioned, the slavery question inflamed, and the army both empowered and alienated. The war had solved an external threat by magnifying every internal weakness. The crown had never seemed more powerful, yet its foundations had never been more quietly eroded. The emperor's authority, so recently tested on distant battlefields, now faced a more intimate and dangerous challenge from within the very soul of the nation. In 1872, a scandal erupted that had nothing to do with coffee or slavery, but with faith and secret societies. This was the religious question, a bitter public feud between the Catholic Church and the Masonic order that forced Pedro II to show his hand, and in doing so, revealed a fatal flaw in his imperial persona. The conflict centered on a papal decree that forbade Catholics from being members of Masonic lodges. In Brazil, this was no abstract theological debate. For many of the empire's most prominent politicians, judges, and military officers including, it was widely suspected the emperor himself were Freemasons. When two Brazilian bishops, following the Pope's orders, began expelling Masonic members from lay Catholic brotherhoods, they directly challenged the power of the secular elite. Pedro II, a constitutional monarch sworn to uphold the law, saw this as a defiance of state authority over church matters. His response was swift and severe. He ordered the arrest and imprisonment of the two bishops. To the liberal elite and the Masonic brothers, this was a bold defense of the modern state against religious interference. But to the vast majority of the population who were devoutly Catholic, it was an incomprehensible and shocking act. The sight of their emperor, the supposed protector of the faith, throwing bishops into jail was a profound betrayal. The mystery here is not about the law but about perception. Did Pedro II, the ever-logical scholar, simply miscalculate the emotional and political fallout? He believed he was acting as a neutral arbiter, enforcing the constitutional separation of church and state. But in choosing to imprison men of the cloth, he shattered his own carefully cultivated image of being above factional politics. He was no longer the neutral father of the nation. He had visibly taken a side, and it was the side of a secretive, elite society against the open faith of the people. The consequences were deep and lasting. The powerful Catholic clergy, once a pillar of support for the monarchy, turned coldly away, their sermons now subtly questioning the moral authority of the crown. Among the rural and urban poor, the incident planted a seed of distrust. The emperor they had been taught to venerate had shown a face they did not recognize, one aligned with mysterious lodges rather than the parish church. This scandal did not cause the empire to fall, but it did something perhaps more damaging. It cracked the sacred aura of the monarchy. It proved that the emperor, for all his wisdom, could make a deeply unpopular decision that alienated a core constituency. It showed that the system's ability to manage conflicts between elites here, the church hierarchy and the Masonic political class, had its limits, and that the crown could emerge from such a battle wounded and alone. The imperial neutrality, that essential magic that held the system together, had been irrevocably stained. The empire's moral cancer finally demanded a cure, but the operation would prove fatal to the surgeon. For decades, the slow dismantling of slavery had been a careful, almost surgical process designed to avoid shocking the system. First came the law of the free womb in 1871, which declared that children born to enslaved women were free, though they were obligated to work for their mother's master until age 21. It was a compromise, a gradualist approach that aimed for abolition over a generation. Then, in 1885, the sexagenarian law freed enslaved people over 60 years old, a group considered less productive by the plantation owners. These were laws of calculation, not conviction, meant to ease the elite into an inevitable future while minimizing economic disruption. They acknowledged the coming end but delayed its full impact, creating a twilight period where the institution was dying but still very much alive. The true mystery, however, revolves around the final act. In May 1888, with Emperor Pedro II traveling in Europe for his health, his daughter Princess Isabel served as regent. The Parliament, after fierce debate, placed on her desk the most radical piece of legislation imaginable, the Golden Law. Its text was stunningly simple. It abolished slavery in Brazil immediately, completely, and without compensation to the slaveholders. With a stroke of her pen, approximately 700,000 people were declared free. Why would a conservative monarchy, whose very stability relied on the landowning class, enact such a socially and economically explosive measure? Princess Isabel's personal piety and abolitionist sympathies were well known, but this was not merely a moral gesture. The political reality on the ground had become untenable. Enslaved people were fleeing plantations in droves, aided by a growing underground network. The army, still bitter from the war and increasingly abolitionist in sentiment, refused to act as slave catchers. The institution was collapsing from below through mass disobedience. Signing the law was less a brave choice than an acknowledgement of a revolution already in progress. It was an attempt for the crown to claim credit for a change it could no longer stop. And where was the emperor in all this? Pedro II's role is the great puzzle of his character. Privately, he loathed slavery and had long wished for its end. Publicly, however, he had always been the cautious moderator, fearing the economic upheaval and the wrath of the planters. He believed in change through slow, enlightened reform, not sudden rupture. From Europe, he sent his approval for the Golden Law, but his distance was both physical and symbolic. He allowed his daughter to take the monumental, risky step to absorb the political lightning strike. In doing so, he preserved his image as the wise, neutral patriarch while the monarchy itself burned its most vital bridge. The coffee planters, the empire's economic engine and political base, reacted with pure, unadulterated fury. They felt utterly betrayed. For years they had accepted the gradual laws, trusting the crown to protect their core interests. The Golden Law was different. It seized their primary capital, human property, without a single cent in return, bankrupting many overnight. Their loyalty, which had always been conditional on the crown safeguarding their wealth, evaporated in an instant. They saw the monarchy not as their protector, but as an enemy that had sided with the enslaved, the cities, and the radicals. The abolition was a magnificent human triumph, but it was also a catastrophic political miscalculation. The crown had solved the nation's deepest moral problem by turning its most powerful supporters into its most bitter enemies. The empire stood morally vindicated, yet politically isolated, having cut the very branch it was sitting on. While the emperor was abroad seeking a cure for his health, a different kind of sickness was spreading through the corridors of power in Rio de Janeiro. The opposition to the crown was no longer a fringe idea. It was crystallizing into a patient, determined conspiracy. These were the Republicans, a shadowy coalition united by a single desire to end the monarchy. But who were they, really? They were not a monolithic political party, but a fragile alliance of three very different groups, each with its own grievance against the empire. The first and most dangerous were the positivist military officers. Influenced by the French philosopher Auguste Comte, they believed in a scientific republic, a government run by engineers and generals according to rational principles, free from the superstition and sentimentality of a monarchy. They saw the elderly, ailing Pedro II as the embodiment of a backward, sentimental past. Their motto, order and progress, which would later adorn the Brazilian flag, was not just a slogan but a blueprint for a technocratic state they felt the empire could never become. The second group was made up of liberal urban professionals, lawyers, doctors, journalists, and businessmen in the growing cities of São Paulo and Rio. They chafed under what they saw as the empire's stifling centralization and its deference to rural plantation interests. They dreamed of a federal republic, one that would give more power and economic freedom to the dynamic, coffee-exporting provinces, breaking the hold of the imperial court. The final and most surprising members of this coalition were the recently disgruntled slave owners. After the Golden Law stripped them of their wealth without compensation, their loyalty to the crown turned to venomous hatred. They may not have believed in a republic ideologically, but they saw it as the only vehicle to potentially reverse their fortunes or, at the very least, to punish the monarchy that had betrayed them. This created a powerful, if hypocritical, alliance. Progressive military men and liberal urbanites found themselves making common cause with the most reactionary elements of the old order. The mystery of their success lies in their methods. How do you build a republican movement in a society with no living memory of anything but monarchy? They operated not through mass rallies, but through whispers in officers' clubs, editorials in sympathetic newspapers like A Republica, and the quiet networking of Masonic lodges and other secretive societies. They cultivated a powerful, modern idea that the empire was an anachronism. In a world of telegrams, railroads, and factories, they argued, a hereditary emperor was a quaint relic, like a dinosaur wandering through a city street. They painted Pedro not as a wise father, but as a tired old man whose time had passed. While the emperor convalesced in Europe, believing the throne was secure in the hands of tradition, this patient force was meticulously preparing. They were not planning a bloody revolution, but something far more subtle, a surgical strike at the very heart of the state, waiting only for the right moment and the right ally to make their move. The final blow came not from a foreign army, but from the very institution the emperor had long relied upon to keep order. The Brazilian military, once the guarantor of the empire's borders, had transformed into a nest of seething discontent. Their grievances were a slow-burning fuse, lit during the horrors of the Paraguayan War and left to smolder for 2 decades. They returned from that conflict as hardened veterans, only to find themselves treated as second-class citizens by the civilian political elite. Their pay was a pittance, their equipment often obsolete, and promotions seemed to go not to the most capable officers, but to those with the best political connections in Rio's parlors. They watched as politicians, many of whom had never seen a battlefield, grew wealthy and powerful, while the army's sacrifices were met with bureaucratic indifference. This profound sense of disrespect festered, merging with the positivist ideals of a scientific republic that many younger officers had adopted. They began to see the monarchy itself as the source of this stagnation, a sentimental obstacle to the modern, efficient nation they believed they could build. Yet for all this simmering anger, the military lacked a clear leader, a figure with enough prestige and nerve to actually challenge the crown. That figure emerged in the unlikely form of an old soldier who was by all accounts a personal friend of the emperor. Marshal Manuel Deodoro da Fonseca was a gruff, popular war hero from the Paraguayan campaign, a man known for his blunt honesty and his deep loyalty to the army as an institution. For most of his life, he was a monarchist, believing the emperor was a necessary check on the corrupt civilian politicians he despised. So the central mystery of the entire coup is this: why did Deodoro da Fonseca, the emperor's friend, become the man who overthrew him? The answer lies in a perfect storm of manipulation and miscalculation. In late 1889, the civilian Republican conspirators, knowing they could never succeed without the army's swords, targeted Deodoro. They fed him a deliberate falsehood, a piece of political poison. They convinced the ailing marshal that the imperial government, led by a new prime minister he particularly disliked, was about to issue orders for his personal arrest. This played directly into Deodoro's own paranoia about the civilian elite persecuting the military. His sense of personal honor and institutional loyalty was instantly triggered. He saw his action not as a betrayal of the emperor, but as a defensive strike against a scheming cabinet. The Republicans also stoked his vanity, presenting him as the only man who could save the nation from chaos. On the morning of November 15, 1889, it was not a Republican ideologue who led troops into the streets of Rio de Janeiro, but a disgruntled, misinformed monarchist soldier believing he was preventing an attack on his own honor. Deodoro's motivation was a tangled web of personal slight, manipulated loyalty, and a soldier's reflexive response to a perceived threat. He did not ride out that day to create a republic. He rode out to settle a score with a prime minister. But in that moment, the sword of the empire turned in its master's hand, and the balance of power shifted forever. The catalyst for the final act was not a grand ideological revolution, but a personal grievance expertly weaponized by the waiting conspirators. The morning of November 15th was eerily quiet, the calm before a storm that never truly broke. A column of soldiers, perhaps only 600 strong, and led by the ailing Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, marched from their barracks into the heart of Rio de Janeiro. They moved not through streets barricaded for battle, but through a city going about its business. There was no grand speech to a roaring crowd, no dramatic assault on the imperial palace. Instead, the troops simply surrounded the government ministries in the central square. Deodoro, exhausted and ill, announced the fall of the cabinet, and almost as an afterthought prompted by the Republican conspirators at his side, the end of the monarchy itself. The empire did not fall with a bang, but with a bureaucratic sigh. Government officials, military commanders, and even the emperor's own ministers offered no resistance. They simply stepped aside, accepting the new reality with a shocking passivity. This is the day's enduring mystery. Emperor Pedro II was, by all accounts, a respected and even beloved figure after nearly 5 decades on the throne. So where were the crowds of loyalists? Where was the popular uprising to defend the father of the nation? The silence from the people was deafening, and it speaks to a deeper, more profound collapse than any military defeat. The truth is, the empire had been abandoned long before the troops ever marched. The coffee barons, enraged by abolition, had withdrawn their financial and political support. The church, still smarting from the religious question, offered no moral defense. The urban middle class saw a republic as modern and progressive, and the common people, while they may have felt a distant affection for the old emperor, felt no passionate connection to the imperial institution itself. Their daily struggles for bread and dignity remained unchanged, whether the man in the palace was called emperor or president, When the moment of crisis arrived, the emperor stood utterly alone, a monarch without a kingdom. Back at the palace, Pedro II received the news with a quiet, profound shock. His advisors pleaded with him to authorize a counterattack to rally loyal troops from the provinces. The old soldier in him might have considered it, but the weary philosopher king refused. He would not, he stated firmly, spill a single drop of Brazilian blood to preserve his own throne. This was not cowardice, but the final, tragic expression of his lifelong belief in order and civilization over brute force. He saw the coup not as a personal betrayal, but as the will of the nation, however misinformed its authors might be. Within 48 hours, he and his family were given orders to leave the country. The departure was as undramatic as the coup itself. There were no angry mobs, only a small, somber crowd at the docks. As the ship pulled away from the harbor, Pedro reportedly turned to his daughter and said, "I leave with the impression of a dream from which I have just awoken." It was a fitting epitaph for an empire that ended not in fire, but in a bewildering, silent consensus. The real culprit in this historical whodunit was not Marshal Deodoro or the Republican plotters. It was the slow, corrosive power of apathy and the quiet withdrawal of consent by every elite class that had once propped the throne up. They had all, one by one, stopped believing in the empire's future, leaving the emperor as the last true believer in a dream that had already faded. The ship that carried the imperial family into exile became a floating tomb for a 60-year dream. Arriving in Lisbon, Pedro II was greeted not as a deposed monarch, but as a distinguished man of letters, a curiosity from the New World. He eventually settled in Paris in a modest suite at the Hotel Bedford, which became a sad echo of his Rio palace. Here, the final, poignant mystery of his character unfolded. Publicly, he was the indefatigable scholar more than ever. He attended lectures at the Sorbonne, met with inventors and poets, and filled his diaries with observations on European politics and scientific advances. He was treated with immense respect in intellectual circles, a living library who commanded admiration. Yet in private, the betrayal had shattered him. To close friends, he confessed a deep, unshakable melancholy. The coup, he wrote, was not just a political act, but a personal repudiation of his life's work, a verdict that everything he had built was deemed obsolete by his own people. He refused all offers from nostalgic monarchists to fund a restoration movement. "I will not be the cause of a single drop of blood being shed for me," he repeated, a principle that now became his cage. He would not fight for the throne, because to do so would betray the very idea of peaceful, civilized governance he had always embodied. His existence became a quiet paradox, a former emperor who was more revered abroad than he had been in his final years at home, living a life of the mind while his heart quietly broke. His final wishes, expressed on his deathbed in December 1891, added a layer of profound symbolism to his tragedy. Stricken with pneumonia in his Paris hotel room, the old emperor made two requests. He asked that his heart be placed in a separate urn and sent to the city of Porto in Portugal, a tribute to the Braganza dynasty's origins, and he asked that his body be buried in Brazil beside his beloved wife and daughters. It was a dying man's attempt to reconcile the two halves of his fractured identity, the European prince and the Brazilian father. The new Republican government in Brazil, fearful that his burial would become a rallying point for monarchists, coldly refused. Only his heart made the journey to Porto. His body was interred in Lisbon, a continent away from the empire he had ruled. He died as he had lived his final years, divided, his loyalties and his remains scattered by the political winds he could no longer command. His quiet death in a foreign hotel room marked the true, final expiration of the imperial ideal. The man was gone, and with him, the last living argument for the monarchy's unique Brazilian experiment. The empire did not end on the docks of Rio, but in the lonely silence of a Parisian winter, with a scholar king taking his last breath, forever separated from the soil of the complicated nation he had tried and ultimately failed to unite. The imperial family sailed into exile as a political relic, but their story refused to end with the closing of a palace door. Princess Isabel, the woman who had signed the Golden Law and thus sealed her family's fate, lived out her remaining years in the French castle of her husband, the Count d'Eu. She became a figure of tragic irony, revered by abolitionists yet blamed by monarchists for moving too quickly. Her life in Europe was one of dignified retirement, focused on family and charity, a quiet epilogue to a moment of world-changing decision. Her three sons, the Princes Pedro de Alcantara, Luis, and Antonio Gastão, faced a more complex reality. They were princes without a principality, heirs to a throne that no longer existed. Their adaptation was one of subtle reinvention. They married into European noble families, the Orleans, the Bourbons, securing their place within the aristocratic networks of the continent, yet always with the ghost of Brazil hovering in the background. The eldest, Pedro de Alcantara, made a decision that would fracture the dynastic claim for a century. In 1908, he renounced his rights of succession for himself and his descendants to marry a Bohemian countess who was not of royal birth. To him, it was a choice for love over a hollow title. To monarchist loyalists, it was a shocking abdication of duty. This act passed the theoretical claim to his younger brother, Prince Luis, who lived in quiet study, and then to Luis's son, Prince Pedro Henrique. This is where the modern mystery takes root, a quiet feud over a phantom crown. The renunciation by Pedro de Alcantara was never formally recognized by all Brazilian monarchists. This created two competing branches of the family, each with its own narrative. The Patropolis branch descended from the renouncing eldest son, settled in the former imperial summer city. They lived as prominent Brazilian citizens, involved in cultural patronage and historical preservation, often downplaying their royal claims. The Vassaura's branch descended from Prince Luis and led by Prince Pedro Henrique and later his son, Prince Luis of Orleans-Braganza, actively maintained the dynastic claim. They treat the imperial title not as a nostalgic hobby, but as a serious responsibility, engaging with monarchist groups, giving interviews, and positioning themselves as living symbols of a potential alternative. The current heads, brothers Bertrand and Antonio of the Vassaura's line, are elderly men who still issue statements on national affairs, a curious echo of a past political voice. Their continued existence poses a gentle, persistent question to the Brazilian Republic. Why does this spectral monarchy still have any resonance at all? Small but dedicated monarchist movements persist, arguing that a constitutional monarch could be a non-political unifying figure above the fray of partisan corruption. The family itself is a walking archive, custodians of artifacts and memories in a museum that was once their home. They connect the modern nation to its foundational story, a living bridge to the empire's complicated legacy of unity, slavery, and abrupt transition. The missing heirs were never truly lost. They simply transformed from rulers into keepers of a flame, their divided lineage a perfect reflection of the empire's own enduring contradictions, still whispering from the edges of history. The silence that greeted the emperor's departure was quickly filled by a roar of competing ambitions. The Republicans had won their coup with startling ease, but they now faced the monumental task of governing a continent-sized nation without its central pillar. The First Republic, proclaimed in that quiet square in Rio, immediately descended into a period of instability so profound it made the empire's final decades look like a model of tranquility. The mystery here is stark. If the monarchy was such a stagnant, outdated burden, why did its removal unleash such immediate and prolonged chaos? The answer lies in what the crown had provided invisibly for 67 years, a neutral, transcendent symbol of national unity. Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, the man who had led the coup believing he was settling a personal score, found himself the first president of a republic he barely understood. He was a soldier, not a politician, and his rule quickly became an authoritarian mess. Within a year, he dissolved the Congress and began ruling by decree, replicating the very autocracy he was accused of overthrowing. Facing a naval revolt and widespread rebellion, he was forced to resign in disgrace, handing power to another marshal, Floriano Peixoto. The Republic's first decade was effectively a military dictatorship, a far cry from the orderly, constitutional transition its civilian ideologues had promised. The army, now firmly in politics, became a kingmaker and a constant source of coups and threats, fulfilling the empire's deepest fear about a politicized military. But the chaos was not just in the capital. The empire had managed regional power through a delicate balance, using the emperor's moderating power to referee between provinces. The Republic, adopting a federal system, handed enormous autonomy to the states. This did not create laboratories of democracy, but fortified regional oligarchies. In São Paulo, the coffee barons, now free from an emperor who might challenge their interests, built a powerful political machine. In Minas Gerais, cattle and dairy elites consolidated their own domain. These two states, São Paulo and Minas Gerais, formed an alliance known as Café com Leite, coffee with milk, that would dominate the Republic, rotating the presidency between themselves and freezing out other regions. The empire's unifying national project was shattered, replaced by a pact between local bosses. The early republic thus struggled with the exact same demons the empire had fought: intense regionalism, a meddling military, and bitter conflict among elites. The monarchy, for all its faults, had provided a circuit breaker for these conflicts. The emperor could dismiss a cabinet, call new elections, or use his personal prestige to mediate a crisis. The Republic had no such mechanism. Disputes between the president and Congress or between powerful states had no neutral arbiter. They festered and often boiled over into revolts, like the massive Federalist Rebellion in the south or the apocalyptic War of Canudos in the drought-stricken northeast, where a messianic community was brutally crushed by the army. These were conflicts on a scale the empire had not seen since the Regency. So, what was truly gained? The Republicans had promised order and progress, but the first order of business was often repression, and the progress benefited a very narrow elite. The political system became more exclusionary than ever. With literacy requirements for voting, the electorate actually shrank compared to the empire's final years. The old emperor, in his Paris exile, received news of these convulsions with a sad, knowing silence. The coup had not solved Brazil's foundational problems. It had simply removed the one institution that had historically contained them, exchanging the complex, flawed stability of a crown for the volatile, oligarchic turbulence of a republic without a unifying heart. The empire's final, quiet question echoed through the early republic's noise. Had they dismantled a prison or torn down the roof and called it freedom? Stone and memory hold the empire's ghost in silent custody. Scattered across modern Brazil, its architectural remains stand not as ruins, but as repurposed shells, their original lives erased or hidden behind museum labels. To walk through them is to trace the outline of a vanished body, feeling for the shape of what once filled the space. The journey begins in the cool mountains of Petrópolis, the summer escape from Rio's sweltering heat. Here, the imperial palace is a perfectly preserved capsule of 19th century court life, now a museum. Its rooms are arranged as if the family just stepped out for a carriage ride. You see Pedro II's modest, iron-framed bed, his collection of scientific instruments, the simple desk where he wrote his voluminous diaries. The palace whispers of the emperor's dual nature. The ornate throne room speaks of ceremony, while his private study, crowded with books and geological samples, reveals the scholar who felt trapped by the crown. The air here feels still, heavy with the quiet of a life lived under immense pressure. Yet this pristine preservation is itself a mystery. Why was this palace saved, its contents lovingly catalogued, while the primary seat of power met a far more tragic fate? That story leads us back to Rio de Janeiro, to the São Cristóvão Palace. This was the emperor's primary residence, a sprawling complex where he raised his family, held audiences, and cultivated his famous gardens. After the exile, it became the National Museum, a treasure house of natural history, Egyptian mummies, and indigenous artifacts. For over a century, it served as a different kind of palace, a palace of knowledge, a fitting, if ironic, tribute to Pedro's own passions. Then, on a September night in 2018, fire erupted. The flames consumed not just a building, but an irreplaceable archive of the empire itself. The emperor's crown, his furniture, thousands of documents and portraits, the very fabric of his daily existence, were reduced to ash and twisted metal. The tragedy felt like a second death, a final, violent erasure. The mystery of the fires caused faulty wiring, neglect, is overshadowed by a deeper, haunting question. What secrets were lost forever in that inferno? Unpublished diaries, private letters that might have revealed his true thoughts on the coup, artifacts from the war or the court's hidden scandals. The São Cristóvão Palace now stands as a gutted skeleton, a stark monument to the fragility of history itself, a physical echo of the empire's own sudden, violent end. Finally, we travel to the symbolic birthplace, the banks of the Ipiranga stream in São Paulo. Here, the Grand Ipiranga Monument, completed in the early 20th century, enshrines the cry of Ipiranga in bronze and marble. It is a republic's tribute to the founding myth of the nation it overthrew, a fascinating act of historical appropriation. The monument freezes that legendary moment of Pedro's shout, but its scale and grandeur feel disconnected from the likely reality of a calculated political performance. Inside its base lies the imperial crypt, where the remains of Emperor Pedro I and his wives were finally repatriated in the 1970s. His heart, however, remains in Portugal, a permanent division. This place holds the mystery of national identity. Why would a republican government go to such lengths to memorialize an imperial founding father? Perhaps because even they needed a foundational story, and the empire's first act was too powerful to ignore. They co-opted the emperor's legend while discarding his descendants, embedding the monarchy's origin story into the republic's soil. These architectural ghosts are more than tourist stops. They are silent witnesses, each holding a different piece of the puzzle. Petrópolis shows us the man, São Cristóvão's ruins whisper of catastrophic loss, and Ipiranga reveals how history is constantly rewritten. Together, they form a map of memory where every stone and empty space asks us what we choose to preserve, what we accidentally destroy, and what stories we build upon the foundations of the past. The empire's most enduring legacy is not in its palaces, but in the invisible architecture of the nation itself. Beyond the political drama, the monarchy imprinted a set of deep, lasting codes onto Brazil's very identity, patterns so fundamental they often go unnoticed. The first and most obvious is language. While Spanish America fractured into numerous republics, each developing distinct accents and slang, Brazil remained a single, vast territory under one crown. This political unity acted as a linguistic anchor. The Portuguese spoken in Rio de Janeiro was the language of the court, the law, and high culture, radiating outward to the frontiers. Unlike the many variants of Spanish that evolved across separate nations, Brazilian Portuguese maintained a remarkable cohesion. A rancher in the far south and a rubber tapper in the Amazon, though separated by thousands of miles, could fundamentally understand each other because they were subjects of the same emperor. This linguistic unity, forged by the crown, created a powerful tool for national integration that the Republic simply inherited. Beneath the language lies a legal framework. The empire built its laws not on local custom alone, but on the ancient, structured foundation of Roman law imported from Portugal. This system emphasized written codes, centralized authority, and a civil tradition where rights and responsibilities were defined by the state. It created a legal culture that valued order and procedure, a stark contrast to the common law traditions of negotiation and precedent found in other parts of the Americas. This imperial legal inheritance meant that when the Republic was declared, it did not start from scratch. It inherited a functioning bureaucracy, a national court system, and a concept of citizenship defined by a central authority. The Republic changed the head of state, but it largely kept the body of laws the empire had built, providing a crucial continuity that prevented total collapse. Perhaps the most profound and debated imprint is on the national character. The empire's history is strikingly devoid of the bloody, ideological revolutions that scarred so many of its neighbors. Its independence was negotiated, its regency crises were resolved by a political deal to crown a boy emperor. Even its downfall was a nearly bloodless coup. This pattern of managed transition, of change through elite negotiation rather than popular uprising, fostered a political culture of conciliation and a deep aversion to radical rupture. Some scholars argue this created a Brazilian tendency for jeitinho, the famous knack for finding flexible, informal solutions, and a preference for compromise over confrontation. The emperor himself embodied this as the moderating power, the paternalistic figure who settled disputes from above. The mystery is whether this legacy is a strength or a weakness. Did it spare Brazil the horrors of civil war, or did it simply entrench elite control and delay necessary social upheavals? The contrast with the Republic's record is telling. Once the neutral, paternalistic crown was removed, political conflict became significantly more violent. The early Republic faced massive armed rebellions like the War of Canudos, where tens of thousands were slaughtered. Later, the 20th century saw dictatorships, political assassinations, and hardened ideological battles. It seems the empire's greatest cultural gift, a preference for order and negotiated change, may have also been its most confining one, leaving the nation unprepared for the raw, unfiltered conflicts of modern democracy. The ghost in the machine of modern Brazil, then, is this imperial temperament, a yearning for harmony, a trust in central authority, and a quiet question of what price was paid for that stability. The empire's most celebrated achievement, abolition, was also its deepest and most enduring failure. To understand this paradox, we must look past the final signature on the Golden Law and into the decades of calculated delay that preceded it. The question is not why Brazil finally ended slavery, but why it clung to the institution for so long, becoming the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to do so. The answer is a tangle of economic addiction, political cowardice, and a societal structure engineered to maintain a brutal hierarchy. The coffee boom of the mid-19th century did not just create wealth, it created an insatiable hunger for captive labor. Each new plantation carved from the wilderness required hundreds of workers, and the entire financial system of the empire, from bank loans to export revenues, became collateral against human lives. The planter class, wielding immense power in parliament, viewed any threat to slavery as an existential threat to Brazil itself. Their political strategy was one of masterful obstruction, agreeing only to the slowest, most gradual measures that would placate international pressure without disrupting their profits. They supported laws like the Free Womb Act because it changed little in the present, ensuring another generation of bound labor from the children it supposedly freed. This was a system of moral compromise dressed as progress. At the center of this stood Emperor Pedro II, the man who privately called slavery a national cancer. His personal writings and conversations with foreign visitors reveal a profound intellectual and moral disgust for the institution. He believed it corrupted the nation's character and hindered its entry into the civilized world. Yet his political actions were consistently, frustratingly cautious. He advocated for gradual emancipation, for education, for preparing the nation for a transition he feared would unleash economic chaos and social war if handled abruptly. This gap between his private conviction and public policy is the great enigma of his character. Was he a principled man trapped by political reality, or a hesitant leader who privileged stability over justice? The evidence suggests he was both. He used his moderating power to gently nudge the issue forward, but he never wielded it to force a decisive break, always fearing the collapse of the very imperial order he was sworn to uphold. In doing so, the empire became an architect of a specific kind of racial future. Unlike the stark segregation that followed abolition in the United States, Brazil developed a complex, fluid, and insidious system of racial hierarchy. The empire's laws and social practices encouraged a narrative of racial democracy, a blending of peoples where skin color was a spectrum, not a binary. This was not true equality, but a sophisticated tool of control. By offering the possibility of social mobility through whitening, either through marriage, military service, or cultural assimilation, the system diffused the kind of unified racial solidarity that could threaten the established order. It placed the blame for poverty and lack of advancement on individual circumstance rather than systemic injustice, a legacy that persists. The delayed, uncompensated abolition of 1888 did not dismantle this hierarchy, it simply froze it in place. It freed people without giving them land, education, or economic opportunity, casting them into a society that was structurally designed to keep them at the bottom. The former slave owners received nothing, and their bitterness fueled the coup. The formerly enslaved received nothing but their freedom, and their descendants inherited a world of entrenched inequality. The stain of slavery, therefore, is not just in the empire's participation in it, but in the specific way it managed, prolonged, and then abandoned its resolution. The monarchy solved its greatest moral crisis in a way that guaranteed the crisis would live on, woven into the fabric of the nation it left behind. The empire's silence on true racial justice echoes louder than any decree it ever signed. History is not a closed book, but a collection of whispers waiting to be heard. For decades after the empire's fall, its true story lay scattered in locked archives, sealed diaries, and forgotten attics, a puzzle for historians to slowly piece together. The most vital clues come from the emperor's own hand. Pedro II was a compulsive diarist, filling thousands of pages with his daily observations, political frustrations, and scientific curiosities. These diaries, written in his elegant, precise script, are a direct line to his inner world. They reveal not a powerful monarch plotting grand strategy, but a weary, often lonely man, confiding his doubts about ministers, his grief over his wife's death, and his deep, private shame over the cancer of slavery. In one poignant entry, he laments the hollow ceremony of his role, writing of feeling like an actor trapped in a play written by others. This is the human reality behind the imperial portrait. Alongside these personal journals, a vast web of diplomatic correspondence between Brazil, Britain, Portugal, and other powers tells a different story, one of realpolitik and hidden leverage. Letters between ambassadors and foreign ministers detail the quiet British pressure that secured Brazil's smooth independence and later forced the end of the slave trade. They show an empire constantly negotiating its sovereignty, its policies shaped in London and Paris as much as in Rio. Newspaper archives from the era add another layer, full of fiery editorials from Republican papers and sycophantic praise from monarchist ones, together creating the noisy public atmosphere in which conspiracy could thrive. By cross-referencing these sources, historians perform a kind of detective work. They can trace how a rumor printed in a Republican newspaper might have reached Marshal Deodoro and been twisted into the false report of his impending arrest, the very spark that ignited the coup. Some of the most compelling discoveries are still emerging. In the 1970s, a trove of glass plate negatives was found in an old collection, later confirmed to be Pedro II's personal photographic archive. The emperor was an avid early photographer, and these images are a silent, stunning window into his mind. He did not just photograph family and formal events. He pointed his camera at the peculiar and the mundane, the geometry of a spider's web, the weathered face of an enslaved person, the stark beauty of a barren landscape. These photos feel less like royal records and more like the studies of a scientist or an artist, capturing details others overlooked. They suggest a ruler who often felt more like an observer of his own country than its master, a man seeking to understand a world that was rapidly leaving him behind. Every few years, a new cache of letters surfaces in a private family collection or a mislabeled box in a national archive. A recently uncovered batch of correspondence between Princess Isabel and her confidantes, for instance, sheds new light on the agonizing pressure she felt before signing the Golden Law, revealing she feared it would cause a civil war. Other letters hint at unreported plots within the military in the 1880s, abortive conspiracies that preceded the final, successful coup. Each discovery subtly rewrites the narrative, adding shades of gray to what seemed black and white. This is the enduring mystery and the thrill of the craft. The story of the Empire of Brazil is not a finished monument but an ongoing investigation. The archives are a crime scene, and every faded letter, every diary entry, every cryptic photograph is a piece of evidence, waiting for the next historian to ask the right question and listen for the next whisper from the past. Deep in the digital age, a ghost from the 19th century still sends messages. On social media platforms and in quiet lecture halls, small but vocal groups of Brazilians advocate for a startling idea: the restoration of the monarchy. In a vast, vibrant democracy, this seems like a historical fantasy, a quaint hobby for eccentrics. Yet the persistence of these monarchist movements poses a genuine puzzle. Who, in the 21st century, would seriously want an emperor back? The answer is not a monolith, but a spectrum of disillusionment and idealism. For some, it is pure nostalgia, a romantic attachment to the pageantry and perceived dignity of the imperial past, often fueled by a curated memory that glosses over the empire's profound contradictions. They share carefully colorized portraits of Pedro II, circulate quotes about his integrity, and lament the loss of a unifying national symbol. For a larger segment, however, monarchism is not about the past but a furious critique of the present. It is a protest vote against a political system they view as irredeemably corrupt, unstable, and short-sighted. They point to the endless parade of corruption scandals, the bitter partisan warfare in Congress, and the perceived inefficiency of presidential republics. To them, a constitutional monarch, like those in Sweden or the United Kingdom, represents a solution, a non-political, permanent head of state who stands above the fray, embodying national continuity and acting as a moral check on elected politicians. Their argument is one of stability. They claim the empire's 67 years under Pedro II saw fewer institutional crises than the republic's first 67 years, framing the moderating power of the crown as a missing piece in Brazil's turbulent democracy. Their activities are a blend of education and activism. They host seminars on imperial history, publish articles online, and occasionally stage modest, polite demonstrations wearing 19th-century-style ribbons or carrying the imperial flag, a green and yellow banner with an armillary sphere. They carefully track the lives of the Orleans-Braganza descendants, debating the complex dynastic question. Most support the claim of Prince Bertrand of Orleans-Braganza, the great-great-grandson of Emperor Pedro II, who is now in his 80s and occasionally gives interviews speaking of national unity and traditional values. He and his brother maintain a dignified, almost scholarly presence, acting as custodians of memory rather than fiery pretenders to a throne. Their influence is microscopic, a footnote in national polls. Yet their very existence is the mystery. They are a living echo, a reminder that the empire's end was not a unanimous verdict but a decision made by a narrow elite. Their persistence asks a quiet, uncomfortable question about every republic. What did we lose when we made that choice? the monarchists may never come close to power, but they serve as a peculiar mirror, reflecting a deep and enduring longing for a stability that history may have never truly delivered. Perhaps the most haunting question about the Empire of Brazil is the one history never answered. We can trace the events that led to its quiet end, but we are left staring at the void of what might have been. This is the realm of the counterfactual, a playground for historians and dreamers alike, where shifting a single variable could have rewritten an entire century. Let us explore a few of these tantalizing possibilities, not as definitive answers, but as a way to measure the weight of the decisions that were actually made. First, consider the profound dynastic weakness. Emperor Pedro II had no surviving son. His heir was his daughter, Princess Isabel, a politically polarizing figure in a deeply patriarchal society. But what if a male heir had existed? A crown prince, raised from birth to inherit the throne, would have presented a powerful symbol of continuity. The military conspirators of 1889 might have hesitated to overthrow a system with a clear, direct line of succession, a young man who could command the loyalty of the army itself. The monarchy would not have appeared as a fading institution ending with a sick old man, but as a living dynasty with a future. This simple biological fact, the lack of a male heir, was a crack in the foundation that the Republicans expertly exploited. Now shift the focus to the emperor's relationship with the army. Pedro II saw the military as a tool, not a partner. What if he had recognized the brewing discontent earlier and acted decisively? Imagine if, in the 1870s, he had systematically reformed the armed forces, improving pay, modernizing equipment, and integrating loyal officers into the political establishment, binding their fortunes to the crown. A military that felt respected and invested in the imperial system would have been far less likely to listen to the whispers of Republican plotters. Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca might have remained a loyal monarchist commander, and the coup of November 15th may never have found its sword. The most explosive variable of all was slavery. The Golden Law of 1888 was a moral triumph but a political earthquake because it stripped the planters of their wealth without compensation. What if abolition had been handled differently? Imagine a grand, state-funded plan for compensated emancipation, financed perhaps by international loans or a special tax on coffee exports. Slave owners would have received payment for their lost property, softening the financial blow. The process could have been phased over 5 or 10 years, allowing for an economic transition. In this scenario, the powerful coffee barons might not have turned on the crown with such venom. They would have lost their slaves, but not their loyalty. The monarchy could have emerged as the architect of a peaceful, orderly transition, securing its political base for another generation. If any one of these alternate paths had been taken, the 20th century in Brazil might look unrecognizable to us. Would a constitutional monarchy have prevented the rise of the oligarchic coffee with milk republic, or simply dressed it in imperial robes? Could a monarch have acted as a stabilizing brake against the military coups that punctuated the 1900s, using the crown's moderating power to defend democratic intervals? Consider the Vargas dictatorship of the 1930s and 40s. A respected emperor, as a symbol of permanent national unity, might have provided a constitutional counterweight to a populist strongman, potentially shortening or even preventing such an authoritarian turn. Economically, a monarchy might have pursued a different model. With a crown potentially less beholden to the cyclical interests of São Paulo coffee elites, could it have encouraged earlier industrialization or a more diversified economy? Socially, the empire's paternalistic tendencies might have either softened the edges of inequality or entrenched them further under a guise of benevolent tradition. The great social movements of the 20th century, from labor rights to urban reform, would have had to negotiate with a centuries-old throne instead of a presidential palace, changing their tactics and perhaps their outcomes entirely. This speculation is not about nostalgia for a golden age that never was. The empire was flawed, contradictory, and built on profound injustice. Rather, these what-if scenarios highlight the fragility and the weight of historical turning points. They remind us that the fall of the empire was not an inevitable event written in the stars, but the result of specific, contingent choices, missed opportunities, and personal tragedies. The ghost of the empire, therefore, is not just a memory of what was, but a persistent echo of all the different Brazils that could have been, paths not taken that continue to whisper from the shadows of the past. Gold and diamonds can tell a story of ambition as clearly as any treaty. The imperial crown of Brazil, commissioned for the coronation of Pedro II in 1841, was a masterpiece of political symbolism. Crafted from the purest 18-karat gold, it was studded with 640 diamonds and 77 pearls, each stone a declaration of permanence and divine right in a new world. Its design was intentionally distinct from the older, closed crowns of Europe. Its arches were open, meant to symbolize an enlightened, accessible monarchy. Yet for all its intended brilliance, the crown carried a quiet irony. The emperor, a man of simple personal tastes, famously found it heavy and uncomfortable, a burden he wore only on the most formal of state occasions. This physical weight mirrored the psychological weight of the office he carried, a glittering, oppressive reminder of the role he was destined to play. After the exile, the crown, along with the imperial scepter and other regalia, did not follow the family into exile. It remained in Brazil as property of the state, a curious trophy of the republic that had overthrown the system it represented. For over a century, it was the star attraction of the National Museum in the old São Cristóvão Palace, a silent witness to the empire's transformation from a living power to a historical exhibit. Then, on that catastrophic night in 2018, the crown survived the inferno that gutted the museum. Rescuers pulled it, blackened by soot but miraculously intact from the smoldering ruins. Its survival felt like a metaphor for the empire's stubborn presence in the national memory, scorched, damaged, but not completely destroyed. Today, it resides in a secure, climate-controlled display at the Imperial Museum in Petrópolis, its diamonds catching the light under bulletproof glass, a prisoner of history in a palace that was once a home. But the crown is only the most famous piece of a scattered legacy. The fate of the other imperial jewels reads like a map of dispersal and loss. Some pieces, like Empress Teresa Christina's stunning diamond and topaz parure, were broken up and sold at auction in Europe by the exiled family to fund their lives abroad, their stones now lost in private collections across the continent. Other artifacts simply vanished into the fog of history after the coup, likely pocketed by Republicans as souvenirs or melted down for their raw materials. The imperial regalia's journey from sacred objects of state to museum pieces or anonymous assets perfectly mirrors the empire's own trajectory. From sovereign power to historical curiosity, from unified symbol to fragmented memory. These objects were never just beautiful things, they were desperate arguments crafted in metal and gemstone, attempts by a young, insecure monarchy in the tropics to project an aura of ancient, unquestionable legitimacy. Every diamond was a claim to equality with the courts of Europe. Every ounce of gold was a statement that this was a serious, permanent empire, not a temporary experiment. Their current state, one crown saved from fire, others lost to time, asks us what remains when the power behind the symbol fades away. We are left with a haunting disconnect, the intense, calculated splendor of the objects against the quiet, almost shabby circumstances of their end. The jewels outlived the empire, but they cannot tell its full story. They can only glitter in the silence, holding the reflected light of a vanished world. Behind every emperor stood a woman whose influence was often written out of the official story. The empire's narrative, dominated by battles and political decrees, quietly depended on the empresses, the mistresses, and the princess heir, each navigating a world that granted them immense responsibility but denied them true power. Their lives form a hidden subplot of patronage, scandal, and tragic consequence. First, consider Empress Teresa Cristina, the wife of Pedro II. Arriving from the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies as a young bride, she was initially dismissed by the court as plain and unremarkable. History, however, remembers her as the mother of Brazilians, a title earned not through political maneuvering but through a profound and quiet dedication. While her husband immersed himself in books and statecraft, Teresa Cristina became the empire's heart. She funded orphanages, hospitals, and schools, her charity personal and persistent. More crucially, she was a passionate patron of archaeology and the arts, sponsoring excavations that brought ancient Italian artifacts to Brazil and fostering a national cultural identity. Her influence was the soft power that humanized the crown, building a reservoir of public goodwill through acts of tangible kindness. Yet her personal life was one of quiet sorrow, marked by the deaths of two young sons, a tragedy that secured the dynastic crisis to come. She accepted her husband's emotional distance and the court's indifference, her power existing entirely within the narrow lanes permitted to a royal consort lanes of charity, motherhood, and silent endurance. In stark contrast stood Domitila de Castro, the Marchioness of Santos, the most famous mistress in Brazilian history. As the lover of Emperor Pedro I, her role was explosively public and politically potent. While Empress Leopoldina suffered in isolation, Domitila flaunted her position, residing in a palace near the emperor and wielding undeniable influence over appointments and policy. She was the polar opposite of the virtuous consort. She was the king's favorite, a classic figure of court intrigue. Historians have long debated her true impact. Was she merely a greedy adventuress exploiting a monarch's weakness for wealth and titles? Or was she a savvy political actor in her own right, a channel for Brazilian nationalists to influence the impulsive Pedro at a critical juncture? Her presence undoubtedly accelerated the decay of Pedro I's reputation, making a scandal of the court and alienating the elite. But she also represents a raw, unofficial form of female power in an absolutist system, power derived not from title or law but from intimate access. Her eventual fall from grace and exile were inevitable, but her legacy is the undeniable proof that behind the throne, in the private chambers, another kind of politics was always being played. This brings us to the most consequential woman of all, Princess Isabel. Her story is the empire's great hinge, a tale of monumental action within a cage of constraint. As the sole surviving child of Pedro II, she was the heir to the throne, yet she was systematically excluded from the real machinery of power. Her father, despite his progressive ideas, never prepared her to rule. She was given no seat on the council, no military command, no experience in high-stakes diplomacy. Her political education was theoretical, while the hard lessons of managing generals and politicians were kept from her. She was groomed to be a regent, a temporary placeholder, not a sovereign. This deliberate sidelining creates a haunting mystery. When the moment of ultimate decision arrived in 1888, with her father abroad and the slavery crisis boiling over, she acted with a courage that dwarfed that of every cautious politician in the room. She signed the Golden Law, but was this the decision of a prepared ruler or a morally compelled woman thrust into a vacuum? The evidence suggests the latter. She acted from deep Catholic conviction and personal abolitionist belief, but without a political base, without the loyalty of the army, and without the hardened skill to manage the furious backlash from the planters. Her signature freed a people and doomed her throne, so we are left with the most tantalizing what-if of gender politics. Could a ruling empress have saved the monarchy? If Isabel had been raised as a crown prince, would have been schooled in command, embedded in military networks, allowed to build her own political alliances, might she have navigated the abolition crisis differently? Could she have engineered a compensated emancipation that mollified the elites while still achieving justice? Or was the very idea of a woman on the throne in a patriarchal, militaristic society an insurmountable liability, a weakness the Republicans instinctively exploited? The empire fell in part because its greatest heiress was given the responsibility of an emperor with the training of a consort. In the end, the women of the empire shaped its destiny from the edges, through patronage, through scandal, and through one fateful, unprepared act of moral courage that changed a nation forever. From the outside looking in, the Empire of Brazil was a fascinating and perplexing spectacle. To the established powers of the 19th century, this tropical monarchy was a grand experiment, one they watched with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and strategic calculation. Its very existence challenged their assumptions about how nations were built. While Europe was a continent of ancient crowns and South America a map of young republics, Brazil stood stubbornly alone, a monarchy in a republican hemisphere. How did the world view this anomaly, and what hidden pressures did this international gaze exert on the empire's fate? For the United States, the relationship was a mirror reflecting its own deepest conflict. In the empire's early decades, the U.S., a slave-holding republic itself, saw Brazil as a fellow giant of the New World, a potential counterweight to European influence. But after the cataclysm of the American Civil War and the Union's emancipation of enslaved people, everything changed. The United States emerged with a new, moralizing foreign policy. It now looked south and saw a glaring contradiction. A nation that presented itself as civilized and progressive, yet was the last in the Western Hemisphere clinging to legalized slavery. American diplomats and newspapers began to frame Brazil as a backward place, a moral laggard. This created a quiet but intense diplomatic coldness. The United States, having paid for its principle in blood, could not respect an empire that still traded in human lives. This external judgment amplified the shame felt by Brazilian abolitionists and intellectuals, turning the slavery question from a domestic issue into a mark of international disgrace. The empire's quest for respectability on the world stage was now directly at odds with its economic foundation. In the courts of Europe, the view was more pragmatic, tinged with aristocratic condescension. Monarchies like those in Britain, France, and Austria saw the House of Braganza as distant cousins, a legitimate dynasty worthy of recognition, but one ruling over a distant, somewhat exotic land. They granted the empire its coveted place in the diplomatic community, exchanging ambassadors and treating Emperor Pedro II as a fellow sovereign. Yet there was always an unspoken hierarchy. European royalty saw Brazil as a derivative monarchy, a copy of their own systems transplanted to an unfamiliar soil. Pedro II's profound intellect and erudition won him personal admiration. He was a welcome guest in scholarly circles from Paris to Berlin, but this did not fully erase the sense that his empire was a novelty act. The European press often depicted Brazil as a land of untamed jungles and immense wealth, a place of potential but not yet of refined civilization. This constant, subtle condescension fueled the emperor's lifelong project to prove that a tropical nation could be a beacon of science, culture, and orderly governance. Every observatory he funded, every academic society he patronized, was in part a message to Europe. We are not a backwater, we are your equals. The most critical external relationship, however, was with the British Empire, and it was forged in secrets and steel. From the very beginning, Britain's support was the empire's silent cornerstone. As we saw, British diplomatic and naval power ensured Portugal did not seriously contest Brazil's independence. Why? The answer was not altruism but commerce. Britain's industrial revolution ran on raw materials, and Brazil was a treasure trove. British merchants wanted direct access to its cotton, sugar, and later, its mountains of coffee. A stable, independent Brazil under a pliable monarch was far easier to do business with than a chaotic Portuguese colony or a cluster of unpredictable republics. This relationship, however, came with strings that would slowly tighten into a noose. Britain used its economic dominance to force open Brazil's markets and, most consequentially, to wage a decades-long campaign to end the Atlantic slave trade. British warships patrolled the coast, intercepting slave ships in a practice that bruised Brazilian sovereignty even as it advanced a moral cause. For the Brazilian elite, Britain was a frustrating paradox, the guarantor of their independence and the primary obstacle to their most profitable business. This complex dance of dependence and resentment shaped imperial policy for generations. To Brazil's South American neighbors, the empire was an object of deep suspicion and rivalry. These young republics, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, had won their independence through wars against European crowns. To them, a monarchy on the continent was an ideological affront, a living reminder of the colonial past they had violently rejected. They saw the Brazilian emperor not as a neutral neighbor, but as a potential expansionist, a monarch who might seek to impose his system beyond his borders. This fear was not entirely unfounded. The empire did have border disputes and intervened in the affairs of the Platine region, culminating in the horrific War of the Triple Alliance. That conflict cemented the Republic's view of Brazil as an imperialist bully, a giant using its monarchy to justify regional domination. This isolation in its own neighborhood forced the empire to constantly look across the Atlantic for validation, deepening its cultural and economic ties to Europe and widening the gulf with the nations that shared its continent. The empire was, in a very real sense, a diplomatic island, more connected to London and Paris than to Buenos Aires or Montevideo. This international spyglass, trained on Rio de Janeiro, created a powerful external pressure cooker. The empire was caught between the moral judgment of the post-Civil War United States, the condescending expectations of Europe, the commercial demands of Britain, and the hostile skepticism of its Republican neighbors. To survive, it had to perform a constant, exhausting balancing act. It had to appear modern enough for Europe, moral enough for the abolitionist powers, powerful enough to deter its neighbors, and traditional enough to maintain its own internal order. Every decision, from railroad contracts to abolition laws, was made with one eye on the global reaction. This quest for international respectability ultimately forced the empire's hand on slavery, leading to the Golden Law that shattered its political base. The world watched the experiment closely, and in the end, its judgments of backwardness, of hypocrisy, of novelty became weapons in the hands of the Republicans who argued the monarchy could never make Brazil a truly modern nation. The empire did not fall in a vacuum. It collapsed under the weight of a world that never quite believed in it. So the final chapter closes not with a verdict but with a lingering echo. The Empire of Brazil was a grand, living paradox, a historical mystery whose clues are scattered across time. It was born from a prince's staged defiance by a riverbank, a cry for independence orchestrated for an audience of empires. It was sustained by the bitter alchemy of coffee and slavery, an economic miracle built on a moral abyss. It was glorified and humanized by a scholarly emperor who ruled from a library, a man who dreamed of a civilized nation yet presided over its deepest injustice. And in its final cruel twist, it was undone by its own most celebrated reform, the abolition that severed its last tie to the powerful class that propped it up. Its story is not one of simple rise and fall, but of a continuous, fragile balancing act between tradition and modernity, unity and fragmentation, noble ideals and brutal realities. The empire's ghost is woven into the very fabric of modern Brazil, in its unified language, its legal traditions, its political culture of compromise, and its unresolved social inequalities. It is a legacy of both magnificent achievement and profound failure, a tapestry where threads of progress are inextricably tangled with threads of contradiction. So we are left to ponder the ultimate question that hangs over this entire saga. Was the Empire of Brazil a tragic failure, a noble experiment doomed by its own internal contradictions and the relentless tide of history? Or was it, in fact, a stunningly successful project? For 67 years, it held a fractious continent-sized territory together with a unique and delicate system, providing a stability its Republican successors would desperately struggle to replicate. Perhaps it was not a failure, but an experiment that simply reached its natural expiration date, having solved the problems of its own era only to become obsolete in the next. What do you think? Does the story of this forgotten empire resonate with you as a tale of lost potential, or as a necessary step in a nation's long journey? The archives are still open, the debate continues. We invite you to share your perspective and to keep exploring this fascinating, complex chapter of history.